Hi, I'm Melissa Wintrow. I'm a state representative for District 19. Thanks for joining me today. I'm in our caucus room. I've had a busy day, doing a lot of work with budgets, and we'll talk about that later. But I just want to say, as we start this nice live session, this is my first time. Well, it's my second time to go live, so have patience with me. I want to say I love my constituents. I want to say it's been an honor to serve District 19. We've had a lot of really interesting issues that we face and some really good successes, so we'll talk about those today too, but I just really wanted to mention the constituents. I get a question so often about how do you do it? How do you maintain your patience? How do you find joy in each day? Sometimes I don't. But I think I always go back to the citizens. That's where I get my strength and energy and inspiration. That keeps me going. It keeps me positive, hopeful, and fueled for the very next day if there's something positive or negative. So I want to thank you for that. And some of you have been sending me cards, so keep them coming. I love that. They're on my wall. Right now, like I said, we're in our minority caucus room. We have meetings here. Very fun. The committees that I sit on this year, I used to sit on state affairs, but this year I've been put on the Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee. I don't know how many of you know about that committee, but that is a joint committee that's standing together. So the Senate and the House meets every morning. And for the first half of the session, we actually hear presentations from every government agency of the state and hear about their budget priorities and the governor's recommendations. We sift through those, ask questions, and then we meet all through that time with budget analysts and agency directors and staff and try to do our best as putting and approving a good budget and being responsible with taxpayer dollars. So this week actually, we moved into the part where we're actually making motions and approving budgets. And I have to say, I feel really happy that we had a victory in the first week. It was only a $25,000 victory, but it was like getting gold out of Fort Knox. The Commission on the Arts was created by statute in 1967, and even though it's a state agency, sometimes my colleagues don't see the benefit of funding the arts. And they had made a request for some grants for small towns in our state for their art councils. And these art councils they're more than just great funding agencies for the arts in their cities, but they're also economic drivers. We know the Weezer Fiddler Fest doubles its population on that festival, and that's a great economic driver. So we made that argument, and my colleagues actually agreed to allocate some money for the arts this year, so I'm really happy about that. Next week, we're actually going to be approving the education budget. So you might want to you can live stream any of the committees, and JFAC, Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee, on Monday will be approving the K-12 budget. So a lot of people are interested in that, so I encourage you to tune in. I've been working on the colleges and university budgets because I've worked in higher ed my whole life. I feel like that was a good fit to really try to find some financial support for our universities. I would say truthfully, however, that the thing that I've learned working on JFAC is I think each of us has different philosophies about how we invest finances in our state. And the biggest challenge I see is that I would like to invest more financial resources in our education system, including early childhood learning and full-day kindergarten. I know that I had a good education that was life-changing for me, so I think that's an investment we need to make. Unfortunately, a lot of times when budget decisions are made, we see diversions in opinion when we are creating different staff positions or distributing workloads. And so there's some major philosophic discussions and battles going on about how to spend that money. I'd like to see us invest in our personnel in the state. I'd like to see us, this year we actually approved an employee compensation increase of 3%, merit-based. I was disappointed, though, with the CEC committee in that I'd like to see at least a 1% cost of living increase. Our state employees are really struggling. Some of their positions they're not in competition with private sector or even other state agencies across the country. So I would like to see us investing more in our human capital, but unfortunately that just wouldn't pass this year. But I will continue to fight for that in the future and increase my knowledge of budgets and how to help employees.
What other committees do you sit on?
Oh, good question. The other committee that I sit on Judiciary and Rules and Transportation. This year in Transportation, we haven't had a lot of work, but some of the major discussions came about a week or two ago when folks were discussing how could we support and address some of the infrastructure damage from the harsh winter. One of my colleagues actually suggested a 5-cent increase in the gas tax just for 3 years to deal with some of that emergency spending. We just got a information notice yesterday from somebody in transportation that the first estimate is over $10 million just in some local areas of damage. I was shown photographs of a cattle truck that had basically melted into the road and a sinkhole in another part of our state. So it really draws our attention to our infrastructure and how we fund it. So unfortunately, we have not solved that problem of emergency funding for transportation yet, but I'm hopeful that we'll continue to discuss that. The other thing that we did do in transportation, which I'm happy about, last year I worked very hard behind the scenes trying to repeal the hybrid tax. Not tax, but fee. It was an increase in the registration fees for hybrid vehicles. And 2 years ago when we passed House Bill 312, that was the transportation bill that increased the gas tax and registration fees. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues increased the registration fees in a very unfair proportion. Hybrid fees and electric vehicle fees had a huge, huge spike. Finally, I was not necessarily allowed to introduce the bill, but one of my colleagues in transportation did introduce a bill to repeal the hybrid fee. So they're treated just like any other gas-powered vehicle, which is great. I have been working very hard to try to introduce legislation to drop the electric fee registration fee. Unfortunately, I can't get a hearing for that, but I think that's an unfair fee. Sure, we all need to pay our fair share for roads and bridges and building, but it needs to be fair. And right now, the electric vehicles are paying $140 a year in the registration, and that's just too high. According to the data I had from the AAA and the EPA and looking at different models and mileages, it should be closer to about $80. So I'll continue to fight for that. If it matters to you, I hope you'll email me and I'm the chair of the Transportation Committee. The other committee I sit on is Judiciary and Rules, and this committee looks at, a variety of, works directly with corrections, Idaho State Police, juvenile corrections, those kinds of things. So that committee's actually been pretty busy lately. I was very happy this week that I was able to pass a bill out of that committee, House Bill 146, which is a legislation that builds on the law that we set last year that gets rape kits off the shelves of law enforcement and deals with the backlog that we had in our state, and that actually a problem we've had nationally. So that bill passed last year. I'm so happy about that. I think there's been some very positive changes. The Idaho State Police came and gave a presentation before my bill and talked about the audit system they had done. So part of the legislation was not only dealing with the backlog, but being transparent in the future with where the kits are and how they're being processed. So on the Idaho State Police website under forensics, anyone can look at the audit and see by jurisdiction how many kits are on shelves, how many are being processed, and how many are not being seen as crimes. I think this increases transparency of the law enforcement. I think it supports them as well. So the new legislation, now that we've processed the kits, how do we preserve it and for how long? So this is legislation that really looks after the rights for victims. It supports law enforcement in providing good standards. And when we preserve evidence, and we have standards for that, we're not going to inadvertently destroy it, And by that, we won't destroy evidence that could hold somebody accountable, sends a positive message to the victim that we care about you and you haven't been forgotten, and it could exonerate somebody who really did not commit a crime. So this is a really good bill. A large number of people from a variety of stakeholder groups sat on this and came up with it, so it's on the House floor next week, and I hope it passes both houses.
What do you think is the biggest issue facing Idaho?
I'd love to hear what you think that is, so I hope you'll ask some questions or send me some of your ideas. But to me, I think the biggest challenge facing Idaho today is a lack of balance. Our state government is very out of balance, and that prohibits a wide variety of voices from being heard and being a part of the conversation. We see that show up in Medicaid expansion. We see that show up in blocking human rights legislation. We see that today in voting. Representative Manwaring from Pocatello brought a bill that actually limits and restricts early voting. I can't even fathom it. Every vote counts. We should allow local governments that know their jurisdictions to set the timelines. Ada County is different than Cassia County. Some of my colleagues said they wanted consistent ways to look at this, which is unheard of from my colleagues, but I'm okay with consistency as long as it doesn't restrict and take away opportunities for people to vote. So, I mean, even one vote missing, it's troubling. It's very troubling. So that lack of balance prohibits a lot of voices from, being heard, and I think that damages our state, and it decreases our creativity, and it hurts our morale. So that's what I would say the biggest challenge is.
What were some of the big things to come up this week?
Well, let's see. Some of the big things, many of you I saw in the State House actually. Today there was a hearing for a call for the Constitutional Convention. It eked out of committee. It's a close vote, but this is a very troubling bill in my estimation. As I was sharing with some people at a town hall recently, I'm not an attorney, and I can't profess that I understand all the complications of this. But in the climate of our country right now, I don't see a lot of people coming to the table to negotiate in a civil and understanding way. The Constitution was created in a way that made it very difficult to amend, and that's for a reason. We don't want to amend our founding document willy-nilly. We need to go through the standard process that we would do that, not a convention. There's no proof that it would work, and it's just too great a risk. So I hope you continue to voice your opinion about that. I'm trying to think the other big thing that came about. We talked about early voting. We talked about the CON-CON. Oh, how could I forget? The science standards. The House Education Committee some time ago rejected education standards put forth in rule that we couldn't talk about climate change. Troubling and questionable. It went to the Senate today. I think a lot of people showed up for that hearing. I'm speechless. I'm sorry to say I'm speechless. That we cannot talk about climate change and scientific information that impacts our students. And it's very dangerous because if we reject standards, that impacts what teachers can teach. So I hope you keep your good emails and notes coming. I've been seeing a lot, and a lot of people show up, so keep doing that. I really appreciate that.
What is the most interesting thing to happen so far this year?
The most interesting thing. Gosh, I have to come back to that. I don't know.
What other bills are you working on this year?
Oh, great question. Let me come back to the interesting one, though. Today I had a hearing in Health and Welfare for a resolution, House Concurrent Resolution number 9, and it's to raise awareness about rare diseases and the shortage or lack of pediatric neurologists in our state. A lovely citizen from Nampa named Tanya Harvey brought her son to meet me a couple months ago. He has a rare disease, and this disease was very difficult to detect because we didn't have real qualified pediatrician monitoring his progress when he was first born. And had we detected that earlier, could have made a difference for him. But he is doing well. So this resolution was an opportunity for her to share her story and for us to talk about potential of a network that we could have in our state that brings knowledge to the patient, not patient to the knowledge. In a rural state like ours, we only have 8 pediatric neurologists. That's not many. And so if we have rare diseases that need to be treated, we need to find ways to bring mentoring and information to our rural communities and help support them in the early diagnosis process. So this resolution is really exciting to me, one, because it featured her story and she was able to really share how that's impacted her life. And it provides us an opportunity to have a discussion about how could we bring this network to Idaho and help our doctors and our citizens.
What other bills are you working on?
Well, let's see. I am working on a bill that I just can't get a hearing on, which is very disappointing. As many of you know, we had a citizen of ours murdered, Stephen Nelson. He was lured to Lake Lowell and brutally beaten and died from his injuries. And I believe it was because I think we all agree it was because of sexual orientation. In fact, Wendy Olson, who's the U.S. Attorney, has charged him with a federal hate crime. And unfortunately, the state of Idaho does not have a state hate crime that would cover sexual orientation or gender identity. So our enhanced statute actually says if you harm, injure, or threaten to harm anyone based on race, color, national origin, or religion, you would have an enhanced penalty. And it's only 5 years and $5,000. So I really tried to talk to my colleagues about, if we can't add the words, can't we at least protect people from violence? And I sat on the Add the Words committee 2 years ago, and 24 hours of hearings, citizens sharing their stories of harassment and threats and violence. And my colleagues sat on that committee, and I saw them cry, and they said they wish they could help. And I believe this is a bill that could help. This is about addressing violence and sending a message in our community. In civil society, we will not tolerate acts of violence against anyone, regardless of our religious beliefs, regardless of our personal perceptions. That is never tolerable. So unfortunately, I'm not able to get a hearing. I'll continue to try. I've been asking for support, but very little support from my Republican colleagues for that human rights legislation.
What do you think is the worst legislation that's been brought this year?
Well, I think the worst, and I hope it doesn't pass out of the Senate, is the Constitutional Convention. I think the risk is so high. It is so troubling, especially in the climate of our country right now. I cannot even imagine what could happen. So I think that is absolutely the worst thing to happen and the scariest thing to happen for our country.
Can you give us an update on the Representative Cheney's anti-immigrant bill?
Oh, second worst bill. Sorry, forgot that one. How could I forget it? So Representative Cheney has brought legislation. He's introduced it to basically prohibit sanctuary cities, which we don't have any in Idaho, by the way. But basically the bill is an anti-immigration, anti-human rights legislation. It's basically a profiling bill. So a very simple example, if a police officer stops somebody and they believe that they could be here illegally or undocumented, I should say, they could ask for their papers and then take action. That is unconscionable, and it really damages public safety. Somebody with a background in sexual assault and domestic violence, I can tell you we want to do everything we can for every population to make sure they can come forward and safely report a crime. And I can tell you in the case of domestic violence and sexual assault, if somebody's afraid of being deported or going to jail because they don't have a documented papers, they're not going to come forward for their own protection or the protection of others. So I see that as a very dangerous bill even for women and the movement to end violence against women and girls. So I encourage you to continue to stand against that. I've seen a lot of people come to the State House. I think 350 plus people came when he introduced the bill. I haven't heard anything that it's going to get an actual hearing. Keep vigilant and watch for that. But with that kind of opposition, I kind of wonder if he won't get a hearing. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that the people that came out and showed their involvement and their concern hopefully stopped it.
We've got an audience question. Can you explain a little bit about why the Constitutional Convention could be so dangerous?
The Constitutional Convention can be dangerous because the only one we've ever really had was in the late 1700s, and that just went awry. There's no real guarantee by any legal scholar that we could keep sideboards on it to limit the points that we want to limit. And so, again, I just think the risk outweighs any benefit. We have a way to amend the Constitution. We should use that way. Or we need to, as voters, be engaged with our elected officials and elect the people that will have reasonable discussions and will work toward resolutions. So that's what I think about that.
What do you think is the most interesting thing?
The fact that I'm on Facebook Live. That's pretty interesting. Here's what I think is interesting. It wasn't necessarily a part of legislative session, but we had maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people attend the Idaho, the Women's March here in Idaho. And that number of people, I think, significantly impacted the psyche of the people in this building. And here's another interesting part of that. I've been meeting with constituents. Folks have been coming down to the State House for tours. I just met with a group from Pantsuit Nation. About 30 people came down to the State House this week. And the Speaker of the House came in while we were talking. And I said, meet these great Democratic constituents that came down to learn about government. Folks are watching that. I think that's important. So what's interesting to me is those large numbers, I think, are impacting in ways that we can't even tell right now. So I say that to keep you engaged, keep coming out in those numbers. Being seen is so important. Make your voice heard and show up. I want to thank everyone who's been doing that. I've seen people in here repeatedly, so keep up the great work.
All right, any final thoughts?
Oh, it's been 10 minutes already? I could talk to you forever. You're amazing out there. I guess my final thoughts would be this. Just like I said, stay engaged. Meet with your representatives and your senators. Your voice really does matter. This is the people's house. I hope to see you here. And if you do come, I'd love to host you or meet you. I know I've been getting a lot of correspondence how to support the sexual assault movement, or to end sexual assault, excuse me. So keep those emails, letters, and visits coming. And don't burn out. Pick an issue that you love, get your rest, eat right, and help each other out.
How can people contact you?
Through Facebook. No. Yes, you can contact me through Facebook, but as a legislator, contact me through my legislative email. It's my first initial and last name, mwintrow@house.idaho.gov. But I do have a Facebook page, Wintrow for Idaho, so be sure to like it. I send out newsletters and would love to add you to my list.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. You guys, see you.